The following is a work of fiction presented in documentary style. While the events depicted are entirely fictional, they are inspired by the real environmental challenges, cultural dynamics, and territorial complexities that exist in rural Florida's wetlands. All characters, events, and specific locations are products of imagination. This narrative explores themes of miscommunication, respect for local knowledge, and the unforgiving nature of wilderness environments. Viewer discretion is advised as this content deals with mature themes, including missing persons cases and their impact on communities. The focus remains on the investigative process, community response, and the human cost of tragedy, without graphic depictions of violence. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The morning of October 15, 1982, dawned crisp and clear across central Florida. In the small town of Clearwater Springs, 14 men gathered at Murphy's Bait and Tackle, their breath visible in the unusual chill that had swept down from the north. The forecast promised perfect hunting weather, cool enough to keep the mosquitoes at bay, clear enough for good visibility through the dense mangrove tunnels that threaded through the Everglades' northern reaches. Tommy Brennan adjusted his worn baseball cap and checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. As the unofficial leader of their hunting group, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These were good men, farmers, mechanics, shop owners, who worked hard all year for moments like this. Their annual expedition had become something of a tradition over the past 7 years, a chance to escape the growing pressures of a changing Florida and reconnect with something simpler, more fundamental. "You're ready to see some real swamp country?" asked Jake Morrison, hefting his gear bag with the enthusiasm of someone half his 43 years. Jake owned the local auto repair shop and had been pushing the group to venture deeper into the wetlands for months. "My cousin Billy took me through some new territory last month, said the deer sign was thicker than he'd seen in decades." The group had expanded this year. Alongside the usual 7 core members were 7 others, friends, relatives, a couple of newcomers to town who'd heard about the expedition through word of mouth. Among them was Marcus Webb, a soft-spoken insurance adjuster who'd moved down from Michigan 6 months earlier, and the Rodriguez brothers, Carlos and Miguel, who'd driven over from Tampa specifically for this trip. "Now, Jake," cautioned Frank Delacroix, the eldest of the group at 62, his weathered hands sorting through his tackle box with practiced efficiency. "You sure about this new area? Some parts of that swamp ain't meant for casual visitors." Frank had been born and raised in Clearwater Springs, had spent his whole life working these waters as a fishing guide. There was something in his tone that made a few of the men look up from their preparations. Jake waved off the concern with a laugh. "Come on, Frank, it's 1982, not 1882. Ain't nothing out there that 14 armed men can't handle. Besides, Billy gave me real specific directions. We'll be fine." The conversation continued as they loaded their boats, 2 larger vessels and 3 smaller ones, enough to transport the entire group plus their gear into the deeper sections of the wetlands. The plan was straightforward: spend 3 days hunting in the expanded territory Jake had scouted, camping on the higher ground that dotted the landscape like islands in an ocean of grass and water. As they worked, Frank pulled Tommy aside near the boat launch. "Son, I've been meaning to mention something about that area Jake's talking about." His voice was low, careful. "There's parts of the deep swamp that folks around here, well, they just don't go. Old agreements, you might say. Understood boundaries." Tommy nodded, but his attention was divided between Frank's words and the logistics of organizing 14 hunters' worth of equipment. "What kind of boundaries, Frank?" Hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived here long enough to understand. Frank's eyes tracked across the water toward the tree line where the swamp began. "Let's just say there's folks who consider certain areas private, real private, and they don't take kindly to surprises." Before Tommy could ask for clarification, Jake's voice boomed across the launching area. "Everybody loaded up. Daylight's burning, and we've got a lot of ground to cover." The flotilla pushed off from Murphy's dock at exactly 8:30 a.m., the boats cutting smooth lines through the dark water as they entered the maze of channels that would lead them deeper into the wetlands. The conversation was light, optimistic. Talk of weather patterns, deer movement, the comparative merits of different ammunition types. Marcus Webb found himself in the lead boat with Tommy, Frank, and 2 others. As they navigated the increasingly narrow waterways, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were moving through something ancient, something that operated by rules he didn't understand. The mangrove roots created cathedral-like tunnels overhead, filtering the sunlight into strange shifting patterns on the water's surface. "How do you navigate out here?" Marcus asked Frank, who was serving as their guide through the labyrinth of channels. "Everything looks the same to me." Frank pointed to subtle variations in the tree line, the way certain roots grew, the direction of water flow. "Takes years to learn to read this country properly. Miss one turn and you can wander for days trying to find your way back to familiar territory." Behind them, Jake's boat carried the Rodriguez brothers and 3 of the local men. Jake was in high spirits, regaling his passengers with stories of previous hunting expeditions and his cousin Billy's detailed description of the prime hunting ground they were heading toward. According to Billy, the area was virtually untouched: deer, wild boar, even black bear sign throughout the region. The 3rd boat, carrying the remaining hunters, followed the winding route deeper into territory that grew increasingly remote with each mile. Cell phone coverage had become spotty, then disappeared entirely. The sounds of civilization, distant traffic, aircraft, even the hum of power lines, faded until there was only the quiet splash of paddles, the occasional bird call, and the whisper of wind through the mangroves. By noon they had traveled farther into the swamp than most of the group had ever ventured. The channels had narrowed to the point where branches occasionally scraped the sides of their boats. Frank's unease was becoming more pronounced, though he kept his concerns to himself, not wanting to dampen the group's enthusiasm. They stopped for lunch on a small hammock, a raised island of solid ground covered with ancient cypress trees. As they ate sandwiches and shared thermoses of coffee, Jake spread out the hand-drawn map his cousin had provided. The route looked straightforward enough. Follow the main channel for another hour, then branch off at a distinctive stand of dead cypress trees, following a smaller waterway that would lead to the hunting area. "According to Billy, we should reach the camping spot by mid-afternoon," Jake announced. "Give us plenty of time to set up before dark and maybe do a little scouting." Frank studied the crude map with growing concern. The area Jake was describing sounded uncomfortably close to territory that old-timers in Clearwater Springs had always avoided. But the specifics were vague in his memory. Stories told in whispers, warnings passed down through generations of fishermen and hunters who knew the swamp's unwritten rules. After lunch, they continued deeper into the wetlands. The character of the landscape began to change subtly. The water became darker, more still. The bird calls that had provided a constant soundtrack to their journey grew infrequent, then stopped altogether. Even the insects seemed muted. Marcus noticed it first. "Is it just me, or did it get really quiet all of a sudden?" Tommy looked around, suddenly aware of the unnatural silence that had settled over their group. "Maybe we're getting close to a storm front." But the sky remained clear, the air still. Frank said nothing, but his hands tightened on his paddle as a memory surfaced, something his grandfather had told him decades ago about parts of the swamp where even the animals knew better than to linger. At 2:30 in the afternoon, they reached the landmark Jake had been looking for, a cluster of dead cypress trees, their skeletal branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. The smaller channel his cousin had described branched off to the right, disappearing into dense vegetation. Jake's voice carried across the water with unwavering confidence. "This is it, boys. According to Billy, we're about 30 minutes from the best hunting ground in South Florida." As their boats entered the narrow channel, none of them noticed the subtle markers that would have warned a local resident they were crossing into territory that had been claimed, protected, and fiercely defended for generations. The weathered stakes driven deep into the muddy banks were nearly invisible, overgrown with moss and vine. The arrangements of stones and twisted metal that served as warnings to those who knew how to read them went unrecognized by the 14 hunters who were focused only on the promise of good hunting ahead. They were crossing a line that existed nowhere on any official map, but was as real and dangerous as any international border. The narrow channel wound deeper into territory that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of the Florida wetlands. As their boats pushed through water that had turned an unsettling shade of black-green, the 14 hunters found themselves in a landscape that felt fundamentally different from anything they'd encountered during their 7 years of expeditions. Tommy Brennan tried to shake off the growing sense of unease that had been building since they'd passed the dead cypress trees. The silence was the most disturbing aspect, not the comfortable quiet of deep wilderness, but something more oppressive, as if the swamp itself was holding its breath. Even Jake, usually the most talkative member of their group, had grown subdued as they navigated the increasingly twisted waterway. "How much farther according to your cousin's directions?" Frank Delacroix called across the water to Jake's boat. His voice sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness, causing several of the men to glance around nervously. Jake consulted the hand-drawn map again, though the crude markings were becoming increasingly difficult to match with the reality of their surroundings. "Should be just around the next bend. Billy said there's a big clearing with high ground perfect for setting up camp." Marcus Webb, seated behind Tommy in the lead boat, found himself studying the vegetation with the analytical eye of someone trained to assess risk. The insurance work had taught him to notice details that others might miss, and what he was seeing troubled him. The trees showed signs of deliberate modification, branches cut at specific angles, bark stripped in patterns that looked almost like markings or symbols. Most disturbing were the occasional glimpses of metal objects hanging from the mangrove branches, too weathered and distant to identify clearly. "Tommy," Marcus said quietly, "are you seeing some of the stuff hanging in these trees?" Tommy followed Marcus's gaze and spotted what appeared to be rusted pieces of machinery suspended from thick branches about 20 feet above the water. Probably just old fishing gear. People lose equipment out here all the time. But Frank had also noticed the hanging objects, and his interpretation was considerably more troubling. To his experienced eye, they looked like deliberate markers, warnings or territorial indicators placed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The placement was too systematic, too intentional to be random debris. The Rodriguez brothers, Carlos and Miguel, had grown increasingly uncomfortable as they ventured deeper into this unfamiliar territory. Both men had spent considerable time in rural areas of Mexico and Guatemala, where unwritten territorial boundaries were often enforced with deadly seriousness. Miguel, the younger of the two, had served briefly in the Mexican military and possessed an instinct for recognizing when a situation was transitioning from merely uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous. "Carlos," Miguel whispered in Spanish to his brother, "Esto no me gusta nada. Algo está muy mal aquí. This doesn't feel right to me. Something is very wrong here." Carlos nodded grimly. He'd been thinking the same thing for the past hour, but hadn't wanted to voice his concerns and be dismissed as an outsider who didn't understand local customs. Now, seeing the increasingly obvious signs of territorial marking, his military-trained brother's unease confirmed his own growing suspicion that they were venturing into someone else's carefully guarded domain. As they rounded another bend, the character of the waterway changed again. The channel widened slightly, and for the first time in over an hour, they could see patches of open sky through the canopy. But the relief was temporary. Ahead of them, the water was littered with what looked like floating logs, forcing them to navigate carefully around obstacles that seemed to appear without warning. "Jesus," muttered Carlos Rodriguez from Jake's boat. "What is all this stuff?" As they drew closer, it became clear that the floating objects weren't natural debris. Wooden posts, cut to uniform lengths and deliberately placed, created a loose barrier across the channel. They were old, weathered by years of exposure, but someone had put considerable effort into positioning them in a specific pattern. Peterson, one of the newcomers from Tampa, leaned forward to get a better look at the obstacles. An insurance salesman by trade, he joined the group through a mutual friend and was eager to establish himself with the more experienced hunters. "Looks like some kind of old fish weir setup," he suggested. "Maybe abandoned commercial fishing operation." But Marcus Webb's trained eye saw something different. The posts weren't arranged for catching fish. They were positioned to create a deliberate barrier, forcing any approaching boats to slow down, navigate carefully, and expose themselves to observation from the surrounding vegetation. It was exactly the kind of setup he'd seen in insurance fraud investigations, where people wanted to control and monitor access to specific areas. Jake's confidence finally began to waver. This isn't on Billy's map. He never mentioned anything like this. Frank pulled his boat alongside Jake's, his weathered face grave with concern. Son, I think we need to seriously consider turning around. This is starting to look like territory that someone's marked as off-limits. Off-limits to who? Jake's response carried an edge of defensiveness. It's public land. We've got every right to be here. Legal right and practical wisdom are two different things, Frank replied. Some parts of this swamp operate by older rules than what's written in any government book. The conversation was interrupted by a discovery that made several of the men deeply uncomfortable. As they carefully navigated around the floating barriers, Tommy noticed something that made his stomach tighten with apprehension. Attached to several of the posts just below the waterline were metal objects that looked disturbingly like pieces of previous boats. Fragments of aluminum hull, sections of outboard motor housing, strips of fiberglass that had been deliberately tied to the barriers. "Marcus, you seeing this?" Tommy called softly to the insurance investigator. Marcus studied the underwater attachments with growing alarm. These weren't random pieces of debris that had washed up against the barriers. They had been carefully secured with wire and rope, arranged in patterns that served as unmistakable warnings to anyone intelligent enough to recognize their significance. "Those are boat parts," Marcus said quietly. "Somebody's been collecting them and using them as decorations, I guess, or warnings." Miguel Rodriguez had also spotted the submerged artifacts, and his military training provided a much darker interpretation. In conflict zones, he'd seen similar displays. Pieces of destroyed equipment deliberately exhibited to demonstrate the fate that awaited those who challenged local authority. The practice was psychological warfare, designed to demoralize and intimidate potential threats. "We need to leave," Miguel said firmly, speaking directly to Tommy. "Right now. This is not a place for tourists." But Jake's pride was now invested in the expedition's success. 14 men had taken time off work, invested money in equipment and supplies, and trusted him to lead them to productive hunting ground. The thought of turning back empty-handed because of vague fears and superstitious warnings was unacceptable. "Look, I understand everyone's getting spooked," Jake declared, "but we're experienced hunters. We've dealt with difficult terrain before. There's nothing out here that 14 armed men can't handle." Frank's expression darkened at Jake's bravado. 6 decades of working these waters had taught him that confidence without wisdom was often a fatal combination in the Florida wilderness. "Jake, you're making a mistake. There are things in this swamp that don't care how many guns you're carrying." "What kind of things?" Peterson asked, trying to maintain a tone of rational skepticism. "We're not talking about ghosts or monsters here. This is 1982, not the 1800s. Frank hesitated, struggling to articulate knowledge that had been passed down through generations of swamp dwellers. Warnings about territorial disputes that predated official maps, about communities that enforced their boundaries without regard for government authority, about places where different rules applied. "There's families out here," Frank finally said. "Old families. Been living in the deep swamp for generations, since before there was official law enforcement, before there was much of anything resembling modern civilization. They've got their own ways of handling problems, their own ideas about who belongs where." "You're talking about moonshiners, drug runners." Peterson's insurance background made him automatically categorize risks into familiar patterns. "I'm talking about people who consider certain areas their private territory and who have the means and the will to enforce those claims," Frank replied. "People who don't make warnings, don't file legal papers, don't call the sheriff when they want someone to leave." The discussion might have continued, but at that moment they heard something that settled the immediate question of whether to proceed. From somewhere ahead of them, carried on the still air, came the unmistakable sound of a boat motor. Not the high whine of an outboard, but the deeper, more powerful rumble of something larger and more substantial. "See?" Jake said with obvious relief. "There's other people out here. If it was really dangerous territory, would locals be running boats through it?" But Frank's expression had darkened further. In his experience, people who operated boats in the deep swamp's most remote areas usually had very specific reasons for being there. reasons that rarely involved welcoming unexpected visitors. Miguel Rodriguez was thinking along similar lines. The sound of the approaching engine had a purposeful quality that suggested its operators knew exactly where they were going and why. More troubling was the engine's specifications, powerful enough to navigate difficult terrain quickly, substantial enough to carry significant cargo or personnel. That's not necessarily a good sign, Frank warned. Might be exactly the opposite. The sound of the motor grew closer, though the thick vegetation made it impossible to determine the exact direction. The engine note suggested something in the range of a 20-foot vessel with serious horsepower, the kind of boat used by people who needed to move quickly and efficiently through challenging waters. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the engine noise stopped. The silence that followed was even more oppressive than before, laden with a tension that made several of the men instinctively check their weapons. Tommy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. In his experience as a hunting guide, unexpected silence in the wilderness usually meant that predators were nearby, either human or animal. The complete cessation of engine noise suggested that whoever was operating the other boat had deliberately shut down their motor, possibly to listen or observe. Why would they cut their engine? Marcus asked quietly. Same reason we're talking in whispers, Miguel replied grimly. They know we're here, and they're trying to figure out what we're doing in their territory. They waited for 15 minutes, straining their ears for any indication of the other boat's location or intentions. Nothing. It was as if the vessel and its occupants had simply vanished into the maze of channels that surrounded them. But Miguel's military training suggested a more troubling possibility, that the other boat's crew was now positioned somewhere nearby, observing the intruders and making decisions about how to respond. Maybe they heard us and decided to avoid contact, suggested Peterson. Could be running illegal activities, drugs, poaching, something like that. Frank shook his head. People running illegal operations don't usually shut off their engines when they hear strangers. They either run away fast or they come to investigate what kind of threat you might represent. The implications of Frank's observation settled over the group like a cold fog. If the other boat's occupants weren't fleeing and weren't approaching openly, they were likely positioning themselves for some other purpose entirely. Tommy made the decision that would determine everything that followed. We keep moving forward, but we stay alert and stick together. Jake, you're sure your cousin's directions will get us to solid camping ground before dark? Absolutely. Billy said the hunting area has several elevated spots perfect for setting up camp. We should be there within the hour. What none of them understood was that they had just passed the final unofficial boundary, a line that local residents had respected for generations, maintained by people who took territorial violations very seriously indeed. The floating barriers hadn't been placed to keep out casual trespassers. They were a last warning for those intelligent enough to recognize and respect the message. The decision to continue forward meant they were now operating under a completely different set of rules. Rules that had been established long before official law enforcement had any meaningful presence in the deep swamp. Rules that were enforced by people who considered government authority irrelevant to their traditional territorial claims. As their boats continued deeper into the forbidden territory, Marcus found himself thinking about the insurance investigations he'd conducted, cases where people had made small, seemingly reasonable decisions that led to catastrophic consequences. Every disaster he'd studied had started with someone choosing to ignore warning signs, to push forward when wisdom suggested retreat. The pattern was always the same. Normal people faced with unfamiliar situations would rationalize away clear danger signals, convincing themselves that their experience and equipment would protect them from whatever vague threats they couldn't quite define. Marcus had seen it in house fires, automobile accidents, business failures, the human tendency to minimize risk until it was too late to reverse course. The channel continued to wind through increasingly dense vegetation for another 40 minutes. The men had grown quiet, each absorbed in his own growing unease. Even Jake had stopped his usual commentary, focusing intently on his cousin's crude map and trying to match it with landmarks that seemed to shift and blur in the filtered sunlight. The vegetation itself was beginning to look different, more deliberately maintained, with clear sightlines cut through the undergrowth at strategic points. To an experienced military eye like Miguel's, The modifications looked suspiciously like defensive preparations, positions from which observers could monitor approaching traffic without being detected themselves. "Carlos," Miguel whispered to his brother in Spanish, "mira las líneas de vista. Alguien ha estado cortando el follaje para crear posiciones de observación. Look at the sidelines. Someone's been cutting the undergrowth to create observation positions." Carlos studied the vegetation with new understanding. His brother was right. The seemingly random gaps in the foliage were too systematic, too strategically placed to be natural. Someone had been modifying the landscape to serve specific tactical purposes. When they finally reached what appeared to be their destination, the relief was palpable but short-lived. The channel opened into a larger body of water surrounded by several patches of elevated ground, hammocks covered with ancient trees that rose above the swamp's waterline. It matched Billy's description perfectly, and under normal circumstances, it would have been an ideal camping spot. But there were signs that they weren't the first visitors to this remote location, and the evidence of previous occupation was far more extensive than any of them had expected. Fire rings, nearly overgrown but still visible, dotted the largest hammock, not one or two but more than a dozen, suggesting regular use by substantial groups over an extended period. Rope hung from tree branches in patterns that suggested previous campers had established semi-permanent installations. But these weren't the simple setups typical of hunting expeditions. The rope work was sophisticated, designed to support structures that could withstand weather and extended use. Most disturbing were the carved markings on several of the largest trees, symbols that none of them could interpret, but which had clearly been cut deep into the bark with deliberate precision. The carvings weren't random graffiti or simple initials. They followed consistent patterns, suggesting a shared symbolic language used by people familiar with this location. "Looks like other folks have used this spot before," observed Peterson, trying to maintain an optimistic tone. "That's probably a good sign, right?" Frank examined the fire rings more closely and didn't like what he found. The stones had been arranged not just for cooking, but in patterns that suggested ritual or ceremony. Scattered among the ashes were small metal objects, coins, jewelry, what looked like personal items that had been deliberately burned or left as offerings. More troubling were the bones mixed with the ash, not fish bones or normal camp debris, but what appeared to be small animal remains arranged in deliberate patterns. Frank had spent decades cooking fish and game over campfires, and he recognized the difference between food preparation waste and something much more intentional. "Tommy," Frank said quietly, "I really think we need to reconsider staying here." But the practical challenges of their situation were becoming clear. They had spent most of the day traveling to reach this location, navigating increasingly complex waterways that would be difficult to retrace in failing light. The weather forecast still looked good, and they had invested too much in the expedition to abandon it based on what might be innocent signs of previous camping activity. Marcus walked the perimeter of the largest hammock, his insurance investigator's training automatically cataloging potential risks and problems. What he found confirmed his growing conviction that they were making a serious mistake. Hidden among the vegetation at the hammock's edges were additional markers, weathered stakes driven deep into the ground, positioned at regular intervals around the entire camping area. Attached to many of the stakes were strips of cloth, pieces of metal, and other objects that clearly served as territorial indicators. Most disturbing was evidence that this location had been used for activities far more complex than simple camping. Marcus discovered the remains of what appeared to be a substantial wooden structure, not a tent platform or hunting blind, but something more permanent. The foundation posts were still visible, arranged in a pattern that suggested a building designed for specific ceremonial or meeting purposes. "Jake," Marcus called softly, "you need to look at this." Jake joined Marcus at the edge of the clearing, where the evidence of previous long-term occupation was most obvious. The reality of what they were seeing finally began to penetrate Jake's determined optimism. "Billy never mentioned anything like this," Jake said, his voice carrying the first notes of genuine uncertainty. "Maybe Billy never actually came here," Marcus replied. "Maybe he was passing along second-hand information, or maybe he was deliberately sending you somewhere he knew you shouldn't go. The possibility that Billy's directions had been intentionally misleading was too troubling for Jake to fully consider. But as he looked around the camping area with new eyes, the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. This wasn't a casual hunting spot. It was a place of significance to people who had invested considerable time and effort in marking and maintaining it. Miguel Rodriguez approached from his own reconnaissance of the area, his expression grim. "We're not alone here," he said simply. "What do you mean?" Tommy asked. "Fresh sign. Someone's been using this place recently, within the last few days. Boot prints in the soft ground near the water, ashes that aren't completely cold, food scraps that haven't had time to decompose." The implications of Miguel's discovery hit the group like a physical blow. They weren't just camping in someone else's traditional territory, they were occupying a site that was currently in active use by people who clearly considered it their private domain. "We leave," Frank said flatly. "Right now. We pack up whatever we've unloaded and we get back to the boats." But Jake's pride and Peterson's newcomer eagerness combined to override the experienced guide's wisdom. "We're being paranoid," Peterson declared, "so some locals use this spot for camping. That doesn't mean they own it. This is public land and we have every right to be here." "Rights and reality are two different things out here," Frank replied. "There's no sheriff to call, no law enforcement within 50 miles. If someone decides we don't belong here, our legal rights won't mean much." The argument might have continued, but it was interrupted by a sound that froze every man in place. From somewhere across the water, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of multiple boat engines starting up simultaneously. Not one engine, but several, a coordinated response that suggested organized surveillance and reaction to their presence. The engines didn't approach immediately. Instead, they seemed to be positioning themselves at strategic points around the camping area, creating a perimeter that would make departure considerably more complicated than arrival had been. Miguel's military training provided an immediate interpretation of the tactical situation. "They're surrounding us," he said quietly. "Professional response to an intrusion. We're not dealing with casual locals anymore." As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the ancient trees, 14 men found themselves trapped in territory that had been claimed, marked, and protected by people who had been watching their approach since they'd first crossed the floating barriers. The hunters were experienced, well-armed, and confident in their abilities to handle whatever challenges the wilderness might present. But they had stumbled into a situation where their weapons, their experience, and their confidence would prove inadequate against opponents who knew the terrain, understood the stakes, and operated by rules that had nothing to do with modern law or civilized negotiation. The last entry in Tommy Brennan's journal, discovered months later during the investigation, was dated October 15th, 1982. Reached the hunting area. Strange place, but Jake insists this is where Billy sent us. Something feels off, but maybe I'm just tired from the long journey. Setting up camp now, looking forward to a successful hunt tomorrow. Engine sounds from multiple directions, not sure what to make of it. Frank thinks we should leave, but Jake says we're overreacting. Decision made to stay the night and reassess in the morning. Tomorrow would never come for any of them. Night fell over the Florida swamp with an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on the 14 hunters like a physical force. The darkness brought no relief from the tension that had been building throughout the afternoon. Instead, it amplified every sound, every shadow, every indication that they were no longer alone in the vast wilderness. Tommy Brennan sat beside the carefully banked campfire, studying the faces of his companions in the flickering light. What had begun as an annual tradition among friends had transformed into something far more serious. The easy camaraderie that usually marked their expeditions had been replaced by a watchful silence, broken only by occasional whispered conversations and the constant subtle sounds of men checking and rechecking their weapons. The boat engines they'd heard earlier had fallen silent shortly after sunset, but their brief presence had fundamentally altered the psychological atmosphere of the camp. No one spoke openly about what the coordinated engine sounds might have meant, but the implications hung in the air like smoke from their fire. Frank Delacroix had positioned himself at the edge of the clearing, where he could maintain a clear view of the water approaches. His decades of experience in the swamp had provided him with an instinctive understanding of how quickly situations could deteriorate in remote areas where normal social conventions held no authority. "Anything moving out there?" Tommy asked quietly, joining Frank at his observation post. "Hard to say for certain," Frank replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I keep seeing lights, brief flashes, like someone's using a shielded lantern to signal across the water." Tommy strained his eyes in the direction Frank indicated, but could see nothing beyond the impenetrable darkness that surrounded their small island of firelight. "Could be fishermen. Night fishing's common enough in these waters." Frank's expression remained skeptical. "Night fishing happens closer to civilization, where folks can get their catch to market. This far out, people usually have other reasons for being active after dark." Across the clearing, Marcus Webb was conducting his own assessment of their tactical situation. His insurance background had trained him to identify and quantify risks, and what he was seeing troubled him deeply. They were positioned on elevated ground that offered good visibility during daylight hours, but which also made them highly visible to anyone observing from the surrounding water or vegetation. More concerning was their limited escape routes. The narrow channel through which they'd arrived was the only waterway they knew with certainty would lead back to familiar territory. If that route was blocked or compromised, they would be forced to navigate unknown waters in darkness, a prospect that could easily prove fatal even without the additional complication of hostile human presence. Miguel Rodriguez had taken it upon himself to conduct a careful reconnaissance of their defensive position. What he'd discovered during his patrol of the hammock's perimeter had done nothing to ease his growing apprehension about their situation. "Carlos," Miguel said quietly to his brother in Spanish, "encontré algo que no me gusta nada." "I found something I really don't like." "¿Qué es?" "What is it?" Miguel led his brother to a point at the far edge of the clearing where the elevation dropped off toward the dark water. Hidden among the roots of a massive cypress tree, partially concealed by years of accumulated debris, was evidence that their current location had been used for purposes far more serious than casual camping. The remains were mostly metal, pieces of equipment that had been deliberately damaged and discarded, but mixed among the debris were personal items that told a more disturbing story: watches, wallets, items of clothing that had clearly belonged to previous visitors who had ended their journeys at this remote location. "¿Cuánto tiempo crees que esto ha estado aquí?" "How long do you think this has been here?" Carlos asked. Miguel examined the debris more carefully. The metal showed varying degrees of corrosion, suggesting that items had been added to the collection over an extended period. Some pieces looked recent, perhaps months old. Others showed the deep oxidation that came from years of exposure to the humid swamp environment. "Años," Miguel replied grimly. "Years. Esto es como un cementerio, Carlos. Un cementerio para gente que vino aquí y nunca regresó." "This is like a cemetery, Carlos. A cemetery for people who came here and never returned." The Rodriguez brothers weren't the only ones making disturbing discoveries as they explored their temporary refuge. Peterson, the insurance salesman from Tampa, had been investigating the larger fire rings at the center of the clearing and had found evidence that they'd been used for activities far removed from normal camping routines. The stones surrounding the largest fire pit had been arranged in specific geometric patterns that suggested ritual or ceremonial purposes. More troubling were the metal objects embedded in the ground around the fire, pieces of jewelry, coins, and other personal items that appeared to have been deliberately placed as offerings or markers. But it was Peterson's discovery in the ashes themselves that provided the most chilling indication of what had transpired at this location. Mixed among the charred wood and debris were fragments of bone that clearly didn't come from the small game animals that hunters typically prepared over campfires. "Jesus Christ," Peterson muttered, his voice carrying enough alarm to draw attention from several of the other men. "What did you find?" asked one of the Tampa newcomers. Peterson hesitated, unwilling to voice his suspicions and potentially trigger a panic among the group, but the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. The bone fragments were too large, too numerous, and arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than casual disposal of food waste. Jake Morrison had been growing increasingly agitated as the evening progressed, and evidence mounted that his cousin Billy's directions had led them into dangerous territory. The possibility that he was responsible for placing 14 men in mortal danger was eating at him like a physical pain. "I don't understand it," Jake said to anyone within earshot. Billy was specific about this location, said it was prime hunting ground, safe camping, everything we needed for a successful expedition. Tommy joined the conversation, his voice carefully controlled. "Jake, you said Billy had been here recently. When exactly did he scout this area?" "Last month, September sometime. He was real enthusiastic about it, said we'd never seen deer sign like what he'd found back here." Frank looked up from his position at the clearing's edge. "Jake, you sure Billy actually came out here himself, or was he maybe passing along information someone else gave him?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. In his eagerness to expand their hunting territory and provide his friends with an exceptional expedition, he'd never questioned the source of Billy's knowledge. His cousin had always been a reliable guide, familiar with the backwater areas around Clearwater Springs. But as Jake thought back on their conversations, troubling details began to surface. Billy had been unusually insistent about this specific location, almost pushing Jake to commit to the expedition when Jake had initially suggested waiting another year. More disturbing was Billy's refusal to join the expedition himself, citing work commitments that had never prevented him from participating in previous hunting trips. "Billy said he had to work," Jake said, but his voice carried new uncertainty. "Said he couldn't get the time off, but wanted us to have access to the best hunting he'd ever seen." Marcus Webb had been listening to the conversation while maintaining his own watch on the surrounding darkness. His insurance investigator instincts were raising red flags about the entire scenario they'd found themselves in. "Jake," Marcus said carefully, "think back on exactly how Billy described this place. Did he seem nervous about it? Excited? Was there anything in his manner that seemed off?" Jake considered the question seriously, replaying his conversations with his cousin in light of their current circumstances. What emerged from his memory was troubling. Billy had indeed seemed nervous when discussing the location, not the nervous excitement of someone sharing a great discovery, but the kind of tension that came from someone carrying a burden of knowledge they weren't comfortable sharing. "He was different about it," Jake admitted, kept emphasizing how important it was that we follow his directions exactly. Said we had to stick to the route he'd mapped out, couldn't deviate or explore alternative channels. Frank's expression darkened further. In his experience, people who insisted on exact adherence to specific routes in the swamp usually had knowledge about territorial boundaries that visitors needed to respect. Billy's insistence on precise navigation suggested he understood the risks involved in reaching this particular location. "Jake, I think your cousin might have sent us into someone else's territory deliberately," Frank said bluntly. "Question is whether he did it out of ignorance or for reasons we don't want to think about." The implications of Frank's suggestion settled over the group like a cold fog. If Billy had deliberately misdirected them into dangerous territory, the reasons could range from simple malice to more complex motivations involving debts, threats, or coercion by the people who controlled this remote area. As the night deepened, the signs of surveillance and potential threat continued to accumulate. The brief light flashes that Frank had observed from across the water became more frequent and systematic, suggesting coordinated communication between multiple observation posts surrounding their camp. More disturbing were the sounds that began filtering through the darkness, not the random noises of swamp wildlife, but deliberate human activity. Occasional splashes that sounded like paddles being dipped carefully into water. The soft scrape of metal against wood that suggested boats being maneuvered into position. Brief whispered conversations in voices too distant to understand, but close enough to confirm that they were being watched by multiple individuals. Miguel Rodriguez's military training provided the most accurate interpretation of what they were experiencing. "This is reconnaissance," he told Carlos quietly. "Professional surveillance. They're gathering information about our numbers, our weapons, our defensive positions. ¿Cuánto tiempo crees que tenemos antes de que hagan algo? How long do you think we have before they do something?" Miguel considered the question carefully. Based on the systematic nature of the surveillance and the coordinated boat movements they'd observed earlier, their watchers were operating with a level of organization that suggested careful planning and established protocols for dealing with territorial intrusions. No mucho tiempo, Miguel replied. Si van a actuar será antes del amanecer. Es la hora táctica clásica para este tipo de operación. Not much time. If they're going to act, it will be before dawn. Classic tactical timing for this type of operation. The observation proved prophetic. Around 2 a.m., the character of the surveillance changed dramatically. The distant lights and whispered conversations stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that it seemed to absorb sound itself. Even the normal night sounds of the swamp, insect buzzing, distant bird calls, the splash of fish jumping, ceased entirely. Tommy felt the change immediately. The sudden quiet was more alarming than the previous signs of observation had been, suggesting that whatever had been watching them was now preparing to take more direct action. "Everyone awake," Tommy called quietly to the sleeping members of their group. "Something's happening." The men roused themselves quickly, the tension of the past several hours having prevented any of them from falling into deep sleep. Weapons were checked, positions were assumed, and 14 hunters found themselves arranged in a defensive perimeter around their dying campfire. "What's the plan?" Peterson whispered, his insurance salesman background providing no guidance for their current tactical situation. Tommy looked to Frank and Miguel, the 2 men in their group with the most relevant experience for their circumstances. "What do you think? Do we try to leave now or do we wait and see what happens?" Frank studied the darkness surrounding their position. Navigation through the complex channels would be extremely difficult in complete darkness, and they would be vulnerable to ambush at numerous points along their escape route. But remaining in their current location seemed equally dangerous, especially given the evidence they'd discovered about the fate of previous visitors to this area. "If we try to leave now, we'll be moving through territory they know better than we do, in darkness that favors them completely," Frank said. "But if we stay, we're giving them time to organize whatever response they're planning." Miguel's assessment was more direct. "Either way, we're in serious trouble. The question is whether we want to face that trouble in a defensive position we can control or scattered across multiple boats in unfamiliar water." Before anyone could respond to Miguel's analysis, the decision was made for them. From across the dark water came a sound that froze every man in place. The simultaneous starting of multiple boat engines, their combined roar shattering the swamp's unnatural silence. But these engines weren't moving away or positioning themselves for observation. They were approaching directly, their coordinated movements suggesting a planned assault on the hunter's position. "Positions!" Miguel shouted, his military training automatically taking command of the situation. "Everyone find cover and prepare for contact." The 14 hunters scattered to defensive positions around their camp, their weapons ready, but their hearts pounding with the realization that they were about to face an enemy they didn't understand, in territory they didn't know, using rules of engagement that had nothing to do with civilized law or modern justice. The approaching engines grew louder, their operators making no attempt at stealth or subtlety. This wasn't a careful reconnaissance or a tentative probe. It was a direct assault designed to overwhelm any resistance the hunters might offer. In the growing roar of approaching motors, Tommy Brennan found himself thinking about his wife and children back in Clearwater Springs, about the hunting expeditions that had brought him so much joy over the years, about the simple decision to trust Jake's cousin Billy that had led them all to this remote and deadly place. The last coherent thought recorded in any of the hunters' personal effects was found in Marcus Webb's insurance notebook, where he'd been maintaining detailed observations throughout their expedition. 3:15 a.m., multiple boats approaching from all directions. Coordinated assault. Whatever authority controls this territory, they've decided we pose an unacceptable threat. God help us all. The roar of engines reached a crescendo as dark shapes emerged from the surrounding waterways, converging on the Hunters Island refuge with mechanical precision and lethal intent. 14 experienced hunters, well-armed and desperate, prepared to make their stand against opponents who operated by laws older than civilization and enforced their territorial claims with finality that left no room for negotiation, mercy, or escape. In the chaos that followed, the Florida swamp would claim 14 more victims, adding their possessions to the grim collection hidden among the cypress roots. their fate joining the long list of people who had crossed invisible boundaries and learned too late that some territories were defended with absolute and merciless determination. The investigation that would begin 3 days later, when the hunters failed to return as scheduled, would find no trace of the men themselves, only their abandoned camping equipment, scattered and partially burned, arranged in patterns that suggested ritual disposal rather than random violence. The first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong came at 6:30 p.m. on October 18, 1982, when Tommy Brennan failed to call his wife Sarah, as promised. For 7 years, Tommy had maintained the same ritual during their annual hunting expeditions, a brief phone call each evening to confirm their location, their safety, and their expected return date. Sarah Brennan waited by the phone until nearly midnight before calling Frank Delacroix's wife, hoping that perhaps the group had simply been delayed by weather or mechanical problems. But Martha Delacroix had been expecting her own call from Frank, and when neither woman had heard from their husbands, a cold dread began to settle over both households. By dawn on October 19th, the wives of all 14 hunters had gathered at Murphy's Bait and Tackle, where boat owner Mike Murphy was preparing to organize a search expedition. The women's faces reflected a mixture of worry, anger, and the terrible certainty that comes when experienced outdoorsmen fail to return on schedule from familiar territory. "Tommy's never missed a check-in call," Sarah Brennan told the assembled group, "not once in 7 years. If he could make contact, he would have." Martha Delacroix nodded grimly. Her husband had been guiding fishing and hunting expeditions in the Florida wetlands for over 4 decades. Frank knew the swamp's dangers better than almost anyone, and his failure to return suggested problems far more serious than normal mechanical difficulties or navigation errors. The initial search effort was hampered by a fundamental problem. Nobody knew exactly where the hunters had intended to go. Jake Morrison's wife could provide only vague information about her husband's plans to explore new territory based on directions from his cousin Billy. But when searchers attempted to contact Billy Morrison for specific details about the recommended hunting area, they made a disturbing discovery. Billy Morrison had disappeared. His apartment in nearby Brooksville showed signs of hasty abandonment, clothes missing from closets, personal documents removed, furniture left behind but valuable items taken. Neighbors reported seeing Billy loading his truck with suitcases and boxes 3 days earlier, on October 16th, the day after the hunting expedition had departed for the swamp. Detective Ray Castellanos of the Hernando County Sheriff's Department was assigned to coordinate the investigation. A 20-year veteran of law enforcement in rural Florida, Castellanos had worked missing persons cases before, but the complete disappearance of 14 experienced hunters presented challenges he'd never encountered. "What we're dealing with here is unprecedented," Castellanos told the assembled family members during his first briefing. 14 men, well-equipped and experienced, vanishing without trace in territory they know well. This isn't a simple case of getting lost or experiencing mechanical problems. The official search effort began on October 20th with a coordinated sweep of the most commonly accessed hunting areas in the northern Everglades. Helicopters provided aerial reconnaissance, while airboat teams worked through the maze of channels that threaded through the wetlands. The searchers found nothing. No boats, no equipment, no sign that the missing hunters had passed through any of the familiar waterways. As the search expanded into more remote areas, the rescue teams began encountering territories that even experienced swamp guides approached with caution. These were regions where unofficial boundaries had been established decades earlier, maintained by people who preferred to remain invisible to government oversight and unwelcome to casual visitors. Captain Jim Brewster, who commanded the Sheriff's Department's airboat unit, found himself navigating political complexities that weren't covered in any law enforcement manual. "There's areas out there where folks have been living by their own rules for generations," he explained to Detective Castellanos. "They don't bother anyone, and they don't want anyone bothering them. Problem is, if our missing hunters wandered into the wrong territory." Castellanos understood the implications without needing further explanation. Rural Florida contained numerous communities that operated outside normal government authority, descendants of original settlers, veterans who'd chosen isolation over integration. people running from legal problems or simply seeking independence from modern society. Most were harmless, but some enforced their privacy with methods that predated official law enforcement. The search teams were instructed to be particularly careful when approaching areas marked by obvious signs of territorial claim, barriers across waterways, warning signs, evidence of deliberate modification to the landscape. But as the investigation progressed, these precautionary measures began to feel inadequate when measured against the growing evidence that the 14 hunters had encountered something far more organized and dangerous than casual swamp hermits. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic anthropologist brought in from the University of Florida, provided the first scientific analysis of the search effort's limitations. The Florida Everglades contain approximately 1.5 million acres of wetland, she explained to the investigation team. Most of that territory is accessible only by boat. Much of it has never been systematically mapped, and significant portions are controlled by people who actively discourage outside presence. Finding 14 individuals in that environment, especially if they've been deliberately concealed, presents almost insurmountable challenges. The breakthrough came 3 weeks into the investigation, when search teams finally located the hunters' campsite. The discovery was made by accident. A helicopter pilot conducting routine reconnaissance spotted the distinctive pattern of cleared ground and fire rings that indicated long-term human habitation. What they found at the remote hammock provided more questions than answers. The hunters' equipment was scattered across the clearing in patterns that suggested both violence and ritual, tents torn and partially burned, personal belongings arranged in geometric designs around the larger fire rings, weapons and ammunition carefully collected and piled in a central location. But there were no bodies, no blood evidence, no clear indication of what had happened to the 14 men who had made camp at this remote location. Detective Castellanos led the forensic team that processed the scene, but what they discovered challenged every assumption about normal criminal activity. The evidence suggested that whatever had occurred at the campsite involved considerable planning, multiple participants, and knowledge of practices that had nothing to do with conventional criminal behavior. This wasn't random violence, Castellanos reported to his superiors. The arrangement of personal effects, the systematic collection of weapons, the deliberate burning of specific items, everything points to organized activity by people familiar with this location and experienced in this type of operation. Dr. Walsh's analysis of the site provided additional troubling details. The fire pattern suggests ceremonial burning rather than simple disposal of evidence, she explained. Personal items were sorted by type and significance before being placed in the flames. This indicates knowledge of ritual practices that aren't part of mainstream American culture. More disturbing was Walsh's discovery of the bone fragments scattered throughout the larger fire rings. Laboratory analysis would later confirm what she suspected immediately. The fragments included human remains, but not from the missing hunters. The bones showed evidence of extended exposure to weather and fire, suggesting they had been accumulating at this location for years, possibly decades. "We're looking at what appears to be a long-term disposal site," Walsh reported privately to Detective Castellanos. "The evidence suggests that multiple individuals have been killed or disposed of at this location over an extended period. Your 14 hunters may be the most recent victims, but they're certainly not the first." The investigation team's attempts to identify the bones and determine their origin led to one of the most disturbing discoveries of the entire case. Cross-referencing missing persons reports from the past 20 years revealed a pattern of disappearances that had never been connected. Hunters, fishermen, researchers, and tourists who had vanished in the general vicinity of the northern Everglades without leaving any trace of their fate. Most of the missing persons cases had been investigated individually and ultimately classified as accidental deaths due to the inherent dangers of swamp navigation. Drowning, equipment failure, navigation errors, and wildlife encounters provided plausible explanations for isolated disappearances in challenging terrain. But when viewed collectively, the pattern suggested something far more systematic. Over the past 2 decades, at least 37 people had disappeared in the region surrounding the hunters' campsite. All had been experienced outdoors enthusiasts. All had been traveling in small groups. All had been investigating areas that locals characterized as difficult territory, or places folks don't usually go. Detective Castellanos presented his preliminary findings to Sheriff William Clayton in a confidential briefing that would remain classified for the next 15 years. "We're dealing with what appears to be organized territorial enforcement by persons unknown," Castellanos reported. "The evidence suggests a group or community that has been systematically eliminating people who venture into areas they consider their exclusive domain." Sheriff Clayton, a political appointee with limited experience in complex criminal investigations, was reluctant to pursue theories that sounded like something from a conspiracy thriller. "Ray, we need to be careful about the kinds of accusations we're making. Are you suggesting there's some kind of secret community out there murdering tourists?" "I'm suggesting the evidence points to organized activity by people who consider certain areas of the swamp their private territory and who enforce those claims with lethal force," Castellanos replied. "The question is what we're prepared to do about it." The answer, as it turned out, was very little. Higher authorities at the state level expressed concerns about the cost and difficulty of investigating crimes in remote swampland, particularly when the evidence was largely circumstantial and the suspects were unknown individuals operating in territory that was difficult for law enforcement to access or control. Federal agencies showed initial interest in the case, but their involvement was complicated by jurisdictional questions and the lack of concrete evidence linking the disappearances to federal crimes. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit provided consultation on the ritualistic aspects of the evidence, but concluded that the case fell outside their normal parameters for serial crime investigation. "What we're seeing doesn't fit standard patterns for serial killing or cult activity," FBI consultant Dr. Robert Kessler explained to the investigation team. "The territorial aspects, the ceremonial disposal of evidence, the apparent long-term organization, this suggests a community with established traditions rather than individual criminal behavior." The practical effect of these bureaucratic complications was to limit the investigation to local resources that were inadequate for the scope of the problem. Detective Castellanos found himself working essentially alone on a case that required extensive undercover investigation, aerial surveillance, and coordination with federal agencies that were reluctant to commit resources to such an unusual situation. As weeks turned to months, the investigation gradually shifted from active search to cold case status. The families of the 14 hunters were informed that all reasonable efforts had been made to locate their missing relatives, but that the trail had gone cold and no further investigative activity was planned without the development of new evidence. Sarah Brennan refused to accept the official conclusion. Working with several other families, she hired private investigators to continue the search for answers about her husband's fate. But the private investigators encountered the same obstacles that had stymied official law enforcement: vast territory, hostile terrain, and the active resistance of people who clearly didn't want their activities investigated. The private investigation did produce one significant discovery that official law enforcement had missed. Through interviews with longtime residents of the area, investigators learned about Billy Morrison's connection to families that had been living in the deep swamp for generations. According to several sources, Billy had been involved in financial difficulties related to gambling debts and drug trafficking charges. In the months before the hunting expedition, he had been seen in the company of individuals known to have connections to the isolated communities that controlled territory in the most remote sections of the Everglades. "Billy was scared," reported one source who agreed to speak only anonymously. "He owed money to people who don't accept excuses or payment plans. Word was that he'd been given a choice: help them solve a problem or become a problem himself." The implication was chilling. Billy Morrison may have deliberately led his cousin's hunting party into dangerous territory as part of an arrangement to satisfy debts or avoid retaliation from criminal associates. The 14 hunters had been sacrificed to protect Billy's personal interests, but Billy Morrison remained missing, and without his testimony, the theory couldn't be proven or pursued through legal channels. The private investigators reached the same dead end that had stopped official law enforcement: circumstantial evidence pointing toward organized criminal activity by unknown individuals in territory that couldn't be effectively investigated or controlled. By the first anniversary of the disappearance, media attention had moved on to other stories, and official interest in the case had virtually disappeared. The families of the 14 hunters found themselves isolated with their grief and their unanswered questions, while somewhere in the vast Florida wetlands, the people responsible for the tragedy continued their activities undisturbed by law enforcement or public accountability. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic anthropologist who had analyzed the campsite evidence, continued her research into the historical patterns of disappearances in the region. Her work, published in academic journals but largely ignored by popular media, revealed disturbing evidence of long-term organized activity in the northern Everglades. What we're seeing is consistent with territorial enforcement by organized communities that predate official government presence in the region, Walsh wrote in her 1984 analysis. These groups appear to maintain traditional boundaries and customs that include lethal responses to territorial violations. The evidence suggests this pattern has been operating for decades, possibly since the early 20th century. Walsh's research identified historical records dating back to the 1920s that described conflicts between government agents and swamp dwellers who refused to acknowledge federal authority over lands they considered their traditional territory. Early law enforcement reports contained references to hostile natives and criminal communities that attacked government surveyors, tax collectors, and law enforcement personnel who ventured into specific areas of the wetlands. Over time, government policy had evolved to essentially ignore these remote communities, treating them as anachronistic remnants that would eventually disappear through natural attrition. But Walsh's evidence suggested that instead of disappearing, these groups had become more sophisticated in their methods of territorial protection and more systematic in their elimination of unwanted intrusions. The 1982 disappearances represent not an isolated incident, but the latest example of an ongoing pattern of territorial enforcement that has been operating in the Florida Everglades for at least 60 years, Walsh concluded. The sophisticated nature of the evidence disposal and the apparent ritual elements suggest cultural traditions that have been preserved and refined over multiple generations. The academic community largely ignored Walsh's research, dismissing it as sensationalistic speculation based on insufficient evidence. Law enforcement agencies showed no interest in reopening investigations based on historical pattern analysis. The families of the victims found themselves caught between official indifference and academic skepticism, with no realistic hope of ever learning the complete truth about their relatives' fate. Detective Ray Castellanos, who had led the original investigation, retired from law enforcement in 1987, with the case still unsolved and haunting his conscience. In private conversations with family members, he expressed his conviction that the 14 hunters had been murdered by organized criminal elements operating in the deep swamp, but that political and practical considerations had prevented adequate investigation of the crime. The truth is out there, Castellanos told Sarah Brennan during his final meeting with the victims' families. But it's in territory that's controlled by people who have been keeping secrets for generations, and who have proven they're willing to kill to protect those secrets. Unless someone with real authority decides to commit serious resources to investigating this case, we may never get the answers you deserve. 25 years after the disappearance, Sarah Brennan received an unexpected contact that provided partial closure to her decades of searching for answers. A man identifying himself as a former associate of Billy Morrison called her unlisted phone number and requested a private meeting. The man, who refused to give his name or meet in person, spoke to Sarah by telephone for nearly 2 hours, providing details about the events of October 1982 that had never been revealed through official investigation or media coverage. According to the anonymous source, Billy Morrison had indeed been coerced into leading the hunting party into dangerous territory as payment for gambling debts and legal problems. The people who controlled that territory had been looking for a way to send a clear message to other potential intruders about the consequences of territorial violations. Billy was told to bring them a group of people who wouldn't be missed immediately, people whose disappearance could be explained as an accident, the source reported. The hunting party was perfect, experienced outdoorsmen who routinely went into remote areas where anything could happen. The source claimed that the 14 hunters had been killed quickly and efficiently, their bodies disposed of in ways that would prevent discovery, their equipment arranged to suggest ritual activity and discourage future investigation. The elaborate staging at the campsite had been designed to create an impression of cult activity or supernatural intervention rather than simple criminal homicide. It was a business decision, the source explained. These people control territory worth millions of dollars in illegal activities. They can't afford to let anyone think that territory is available for casual exploration. Your husband and his friends were killed to send a message, not for any personal reason. The source also revealed what had happened to Billy Morrison. According to the anonymous caller, Billy had been eliminated shortly after the hunter's disappearance, his knowledge of the operation making him a liability that couldn't be tolerated. His body had been disposed of in the same systematic way as the hunters, ensuring that the secret of their fate would remain protected. Billy thought he was smart enough to make a deal with people who don't make deals, the source concluded. He learned too late that when you owe these people a favor, you don't get to walk away afterward. Sarah Brennan recorded the conversation and provided the information to law enforcement agencies, but was told that anonymous tips without corroborating evidence couldn't be used to reopen cold cases. The statute of limitations on most potential charges had expired, and the practical difficulties of investigating crimes in remote swampland remained insurmountable. The families of the 14 hunters were forced to accept that they would never see their relatives again, never have bodies to bury, never experience the closure that comes from understanding exactly what happened to people they loved. Their grief was complicated by the knowledge that their relatives had died not through accident or natural disaster, but through deliberate murder by people who continued to operate without fear of legal consequences. Today, more than 40 years after the disappearance, the northern Everglades remain largely unchanged. Hunting and fishing continue in the more accessible areas, but experienced guides still warn visitors about territories that are best avoided, channels that lead nowhere good, and areas where people who venture in alone tend not to come back. The descendants of the 14 hunters occasionally organize memorial services and continue to pressure law enforcement agencies for renewed investigation. But the political and practical realities that prevented adequate investigation in 1982 remain largely unchanged. Vast territory, hostile terrain, limited resources, and the active resistance of organized groups that view law enforcement presence as an unacceptable threat to their traditional way of life. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, now retired from active research, maintains that the 1982 case represents only the most well-documented example of territorial enforcement patterns that continue to operate throughout the southeastern United States. Her final published paper, released in 2005, concluded that dozens of similar incidents occur annually in remote areas where traditional communities maintain effective control over access and activities. The Florida swamp killings of 1982 should be understood not as an isolated tragedy, but as a window into ongoing conflicts between traditional territorial claims and modern legal authority, Walsh wrote. Until government agencies are prepared to commit adequate resources to investigating and controlling these remote territories, similar incidents will continue to occur with predictable regularity. The camping area where Tommy Brennan and his 13 companions made their final stand remains accessible to experienced boaters willing to navigate the complex channels of the northern Everglades. But local guides who know the territory's history universally advise against overnight camping in the area, and the fire rings where the hunters' possessions were ceremonially burned have been left undisturbed as an unofficial memorial to their fate. Occasionally, pieces of equipment wash up in more accessible areas of the swamp. Fragments of boats, pieces of camping gear, personal items that serve as reminders of the people who crossed invisible boundaries and learned too late that some territories are defended with absolute and merciless determination. The Florida swamp keeps its secrets well, and the silence that followed the hunters' disappearance continues to protect the identity of those responsible for their fate. In the vast wetlands where modern law enforcement holds no meaningful authority, traditional justice operates by rules that predate civilization and punish territorial violations with finality that leaves no room for appeal, negotiation, or mercy. The 14 hunters of 1982 became part of that tradition, their fate serving as a warning to others who might consider crossing lines that exist nowhere on official maps, but are deeply carved into the collective memory of people who have called the swamp home for generations beyond counting. Their story ends not with resolution or justice, but with the understanding that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some territories are not meant to be explored, and some prices are too high to pay for the simple pleasure of hunting in unfamiliar ground. The swamp remembers, the swamp protects its own, and the swamp never gives up its secrets to those who don't already know where the real boundaries lie.